Good evening and welcome to the Apex Scotland Annual Lecture 2021. My name's Anne Landels and I'm honoured to be the chair of Apex Scotland. Once again, our lecture is being held online, so although we miss out on the networking and sharing of thoughts and ideas, the benefit is that people can join us from not only Scotland, but from all over the world. So wherever you are, welcome. But this is still an interactive event, and if you're joining us live, we encourage you to tweet your comments and thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag #ApexLecture. Let's see if we can get that trending over the evening. The lecture will be followed by a live Q&A with our guest speaker, chaired by our Chief Executive, Alan Staff. You can email your questions to lecture@apexscotland.org.uk. Our guest speaker tonight is Sir Harry Burns, who until 2005 was the Director of Public Health for Greater Glasgow Health Board. Since 2014, he has been the Professor of Global Public Health at Strathclyde University. Sir Harry is known throughout Scotland and internationally for his work on health inequalities, and I know many of you will have followed the way he has championed that in order to tackle poor health and shortened life expectancy, we must address the social issues and factors that cause them. Apex Scotland was delighted that Sir Harry accepted our invitation to be with us tonight. Apex Scotland is committed to supporting people who have had experience of the criminal justice system to enable them to have a positive future. We know from our work over 25 years that often the criminal justice system is not compassionate and does not take into account the traumas and adverse life experiences that many of those whom we support have faced. You can find out more about our work in our annual report for 2021, Social Wellbeing, A Chance to Change Futures, which is launched today. You can read and download it from the Apex Scotland website. Finally, before I hand over to Sir Harry, the video of his lecture and a written transcript will be available shortly after the event. And once again, we encourage you to participate by tweeting and by emailing in your questions. Thank you again for joining us this evening. And now I'd like to invite Sir Harry Burns to give his lecture on Towards a More Compassionate Justice System.
So thank you very much for asking me to do the Apex Scotland lecture this year. The title is Towards a More Compassionate Justice System. And you might ask yourself, what on earth is a public health doctor doing talking about justice? And the reason is that I wasn't always a public health doctor. I started my career as a surgeon working in Glasgow, and for many years I was a consultant at the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow, where I operated on people who came from houses like this. And it became very clear to me over the years that what the people in the East End of Glasgow did not need was more surgery. What they needed was more well-being. You would have a patient come in for maybe the third or fourth time with a serious complication of alcohol. And you'd say to him, right, John, if you keep on drinking, you're going to die. And the response was always the same. Ach, I know I'm going to die, but I don't care, because life's crap, and the booze is the only pleasure I've got. And I quickly realised that if I wanted to do anything about that, I needed to give up surgery, and I needed to try and ask myself, why is it that people who live in very poor circumstances have that kind of attitude in life? And in the course of it, my understanding of prison as a punishment for crime came about through a number of things that I'll describe later on, but one of the things that I've got on my bookshelf is this small pamphlet called Reducing Prison Population. It came from an European meeting that a number of countries attended, and it basically advocates a compassionate approach to offending and reducing offending and rehabilitating offenders. The interesting thing is, when you look at the list of the countries that attended this meeting, the only UK country that attended was Scotland. So, what I'm going to try and argue today is that the circumstances into which we are born and grow up determine our capacity to succeed in life and achieve well-being. Our health, well-being, economic and social outcomes are largely dependent on early life experiences, but even when they go wrong, with appropriate support, we can recover and change those outcomes for the better. So let's start off by talking a bit about Scotland's health. One of the things that you find when you get into this area is that people believe the wrong things. The evidence that, we are where we are because we eat too much and don't take enough exercise and so on, it's much more complicated than that. We believe that we are unhealthy because we smoke too much, we eat the wrong kind of food, we drink too much, and if only we'd get grip and do the right thing, everything would be okay. Well, the fact is, only one of those statements is true, and regrettably, it's the one about the booze. So we are not basically unhealthy. This slide shows life expectancy trends in 16 Western European countries going back to 1851. You can see that with the dark line there, for the vast majority of those many, many years, Scotland's life expectancy was at the European average. It was the average when you look at France and Spain and Nordic countries and so on. It's only in the past 50 years that we have seen the richest 20% of the population grow their life expectancy faster than the European average, and the poorest people growing their life expectancy more slowly than the European average. So the average has fallen in the past 50, 60 years. When you look at what the causes of that are, is it because past 50 years we've seen more people dying of heart disease and cancer and so on? Well, no, as I say, it's more complex than that. A colleague at Glasgow University some years ago examined what the causes of that widening inequality were. And what he did was, he took each 5-year age band in the population, men and women, and looked at their annual mortality by socioeconomic status. So this slide, the blue column, is annual number of deaths per 100,000 population of men in that age group in the most affluent group. And the dark purple one is the annual number of deaths that he found in the most deprived group. And you can see there is a gradient, and you can reduce that gradient down to a single number by subtracting the best from the worst and dividing by the mean. And you come up with a thing called the slope index of inequality. And you can see here a number close to 1 reflects a sort of 45-degree slope in inequality. When you plot that for all male ages, you see a surprising thing. It's not older people that we're seeing inequality in mortality. The inequality in mortality shoots up in teenage years, it's at its highest in young working age people, and it's falling in the 50s and 60s. Inequality in deaths in Scotland is a reflection of inequality in deaths in young people, not in older people. And you can begin to see what's driving this by looking at individual causes of death and calculating the slope index of inequality for them. Here we've got ischemic heart disease, the thing in the middle, and you can do the slope index of inequality for that and superimpose it on the all-cause mortality. And you see that heart disease is a small contributor to inequality. It's not nearly the biggest by any means. So what's driving up inequality in young people? It's drugs, alcohol, suicide, violence and accidents. Social causes of death that have their roots in what's happened in society over the past 50 or 60 years. And so what has happened? Well, 50 years ago, 20 miles on either side of the Clyde in Glasgow, that would be the scene at 5 o'clock on any working day. Thousands of men leaving their work, jobs that gave them some status and gave them some steady income and so on. And then over the past 50, 60 years, those jobs have simply disappeared. They lost their support, they lost their sense of self-esteem. And at the same time as that happened, we began to see significant changes in the social fabric. In post-war years, the Glasgow city engineer decided that he was going to create more livable housing in Glasgow, for example. And what you got was a change from this. This was houses in the Gorbals in the mid-19th century. And what you see there, the houses don't look too bad, but what you see is a community. You see people out in the streets, you see kids playing, adults out there keeping an eye on them. You see friends, you see folk ready to help each other. And what this guy's vision was, let's build skyscrapers. People were taken away from their houses, which were then flattened, and they didn't know where they were going to go. They were decanted into other places where they maybe never saw their friends again. And they were put into high-rise flats that were built all around the place. And that was a phenomenon that Jimmy Reid called filing cabinets for people in the sky. They were just treated like things to be filed away, and they lost that sense of community. Could that possibly be the basis for this increased widening in the past 60 odd years? Well, my studies in public health taught me a new word, salutogenesis. As doctors, we know all about pathogenesis, the causes of disease. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being and safety, and therefore salutogenesis is the creation of well-being. And colleagues at the Scandinavian Institute of Public Health pulled together this slide with 25 different theories that were set up to try and explain how we create well-being in any society. And I won't go through them all, you'll be pleased to hear, but basically they have a common set of principles. Wellness is present when an individual has an optimistic outlook on life, when he feels in control of his life and feels internally in control. He's not controlled by external forces, he makes his own decisions. If he has a sense of purpose and meaning in life, that's important to him. If he's confident in his ability to deal with the problems life throws at him, that's what gives him that positive outlook. But what's also important is the support of a network of people round about him, and particularly the support of a nurturing family. Just one of those theories that was on that slide was the sense of coherence theory of Aaron Antonovsky. And Aaron Antonovsky said that for the social and physical environment to be comprehensible, manageable and meaningful, and if it is important, and if it's not, the individual would experience chronic stress. Now, as a surgeon, my job was to create acute stress in people. That's what a surgical operation is. It's an acute stressor. And therefore my research area was in stress, and I'd noticed differences in stress responses in affluent and deprived patients when I measured it. So I began to look for evidence that Antonovsky might be correct. And this study carried out by Sir Michael Marmot's group shows that throughout the day, people at the lower end of a social scale are more stressed than people at the top of a social scale. The purple dots there are cortisol levels, the main stress hormone, in individuals across the day. Cortisol is always highest in the morning and goes down just before you go to bed at night. And you can see The purple levels, the top civil servants in Whitehall, were less stressed, and the red dots, they were the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. They had less control over their jobs and their lives, and therefore they were more stressed. I also looked at stress levels in children, and what we found here, this is Canadian data. Children in orphanages, the longer a child is in an orphanage, the higher his stress levels are. Something very stressing to a child not having a single significant adult to relate to. Hopelessness was an interesting one. This was a study carried out by an American lady called Susan Everson, who went to Scandinavia to look at a group of men at very high risk of death from heart disease. And she measured all the risk factors you could think of, how much they smoked, how obese they were, how much exercise they took, and so on. But one of the things she asked them about was hopelessness. She developed a hopelessness score, which allowed her to split men into three groups. The red level is men who were very, very hopeless. The sort of purple one is men who were moderately hopeless, and the blue ones to the left are men who were slightly hopeless. Being a woman, she knew that all men are hopeless to a greater or lesser extent, and therefore she graded them that way. And what you see here is that men who score highly on the hopelessness scale are several times more likely to die of heart disease and cancer than men who are more positive in their lives. And that is adjusting for how much they smoked and what they ate and so on. She was able to do that statistically. So hopelessness itself is an independent predictor of bad outcome. So what causes this stress? And we then discover that the basis of it emerges in early life. This was a study I saw in the psychology department of a university in New York. It was a study in which they made baby monkeys depressed and stressed. You can see here that baby monkey beside the mum is not a happy baby monkey. He's withdrawn, he's not interacting with his sibling and so on. So how did they make the baby monkeys depressed? Well, it was all down to how they let mum feed the babies. One half of the animal house, the food was lying out, so that when mum's swinging about the bars and so on with the baby, and the baby indicates he's hungry, she just reaches down, picks the food, gives it to the baby, and the baby's happy. The other half of the animal house, they took the food away and hid it. So when baby indicated he was hungry, mum had to go and forage for the food. She was stressed by the experience. She was away from the baby for a long time, and they measured the stress levels in the babies who were easily fed and those that was hard to feed. And I guess you would believe that the ones where mum was away for a large part of the time, the ones who were more likely to be stressed. Well, you'd be wrong. The yellow triangles here are the stress levels in the babies where mum was away all the time. The green triangles are the stress levels in the babies where mum was there all the time, and you see that they are the same. There's no statistically significant difference. The red triangles, however, are the stress levels where they randomly changed the feeding pattern from one day to the next. It wasn't mum being there or mum not being there that caused the problem. It was the baby not knowing what was happening. It was uncertainty, it was insecurity. And not only did that make the babies withdrawn and stressed, these babies grew up to be obese. And I just mention that because we tend to oversimplify these problems. We tend to think that people are obese because they eat too much. Well, there may be a whole lot more going on in their lives that are contributing to that obesity, and I'll mention that later on. What they then discovered is that the babies' brains develop differently if they were exposed to that inconsistency. And the brains developed differently in three key areas. The first one was the prefrontal cortex. This is the bit of the brain that makes decisions for us. We take in information, we process it, and the brain decides what to do about it. The babies who experience the inconsistent parenting, those cells in the front of the brain did not grow so many connections as the babies who had the consistent parenting. Therefore, their decision making was impaired. The hippocampus similarly did not grow so many cells, and that's important for memory. That's important for learning. The hippocampus is very important for remembering place and just things in general. The amygdala is interesting. The amygdala is the seat of emotion. It lights up when you're emotionally aroused. It becomes very active, and that became more active in these babies. So they were more anxious, aggressive, fearful, less well able to take good decisions on the basis of that fear, and their memories were poorer. And you can see here, in human terms, this is the rate at which cells develop in a child. That for the first couple of years, things like sight and hearing and so on develop quite quickly, language and speech production develop quite quickly, and then the solid line is higher cognitive function. That takes several years to develop. And therefore, during those several years, it's critical to make sure that the child is being supported appropriately. We didn't just take this experimental data as gospel. We went out into Glasgow and asked people, could we scan their brains? The response was often surprising. What do you mean you're going to prove I've got a brain? Would often be the response. Can I get a certificate to prove that? Was one guy's request. But we found indeed that in affluent and deprived Scots, the same pattern was visible, that there was less development of prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. And we also went ahead and looked at the functioning. The choice reaction time, for example, is the time it takes an individual to respond to a signal, press the appropriate button. And it doesn't look very much here. It's about half a second, the difference between the two, even less than that, a few hundred milliseconds. And maybe that doesn't seem a lot, but if a car's been driven at 50 miles an hour, two cars being driven side by side, one affluent guy, one guy who's experienced a difficult childhood, and a child walks out in front of them, the car being driven by the guy from the poor area will take about half a car length longer to stop, because he responds, his brain processes matters more slowly. So what's the basis of this? Well, the basis of the elevated stress response is a process called epigenetics. That's the process by which genes may be present, but they may be switched on or off. And in the case of stress control, this gene, the glucocorticoid receptor gene, is important. It has to be activated. And it's activated by comfort. When a baby feels comforted and secure, he produces a substance called 5-hydroxytryptamine in his bloodstream. Serotonin is its other name. The serotonin goes into cells, it binds to the glucocorticoid receptor gene, and it activates it. Children who don't feel comforted don't get that activation, and that glucocorticoid receptor gene measures the level of cortisol in the bloodstream, and when it's too high, it switches off production of cortisol from the adrenals. So that explains why these kids who are neglected can't control the cortisol, and it explains a lot about what happens to their brain development. And it's not just neglect that does that. There are concepts like the warrior gene, which exists in some populations. I just was looking for a warrior here and picked this picture, and of course that's Gerald Butler, a woodpecker Scot, to show the warrior gene. But monoamine oxidase type A, for example, is associated. If you don't have that, then, and that's involved with this genetic, the presence of this gene, then you become more aggressive in response to challenge. And that has been used as a defense in some places. I noticed that just a few months ago in America, it was rejected in a case of a murder. But, there are some countries where it has been accepted as a defense. And other things can create this epigenetic change. This town of Överkalix in North Sweden collected lots and lots of data on food supply. It's quite isolated, and scientists discovered that they had very complete records on food availability going back 100 or so years. And they looked at children born in times of oversupply, and what they found was that those children, when they grew up, were more likely to die of heart disease. But interestingly, their children and their grandsons particularly were also more likely to die of heart disease. So these genes can be handed down from one generation to the next. The critical study that shows these links between early years experience and outcome, the Adverse Childhood Events Study, which started off as a weight reduction clinic in California many years ago, but they realised that the obesity they were dealing with was often associated with adversity in early life. They looked at 9 different types of events in a child's life, 3 different types of abuse, 2 different types of neglect, then parental absence through substance misuse, mental illness, etc., being in jail. And what they found was a whole range of problems associated with those difficulties. Alcoholism was significantly more common, 8 times more common if you had 4 or more of those adverse events in early life than if you had none. Things like violence, boys experiencing violence at the hands of an older male, 8 times more likely to be arrested for domestic violence, significantly more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. Researchers concluded that childhood abuse and neglect have a significant impact on the likelihood of arrest for delinquency, and they found that by the age of 32, almost half of the victims of abuse and neglect had been arrested for a non-traffic offence. What they are saying is that we need to respond to incidents of child abuse and neglect, and we can play an important role in preventing future violence. More attention must be paid to childhood victims of neglect and the differences in the consequences of abuse and neglect by gender or race. Not just in California have these studies shown this kind of thing. The Dunedin cohort in New Zealand, children identified in the early 70s, now approaching their 50s. At-risk children identified in their cohort have turned out to be more likely to be unemployed, have criminal convictions for violence, experience teenage pregnancy, have substance abuse problems, and have metabolic problems that will increase the risk of diabetes and heart disease. If you look at adverse childhood events, this slide here shows that the more of these events you have in your life, the more likely you are to have drugs, to have drug problems, suicide problems, etc. And a study carried out by Glasgow University comparing Glasgow with Liverpool and Manchester found something very similar. The excess mortality they found in Glasgow was exactly the same. Now, that's not to suggest that it's adverse childhood experiences that are directly causing it, but the pattern that you see suggests that chaos in childhood, insecurity in childhood, is behind a lot of these problems. And not only are they expensive in human terms, but they're expensive in terms of society at large. Mark Bellis, who runs the Welsh public health system, calculated that the annual cost in terms of healthcare and imprisonment and so on of adverse events in Europe amounted to £581 billion. And if you look at the population size of Scotland, the annual cost of adverse childhood events in Scotland, by this reckoning, would be about £3.9 billion each year. Government spends that dealing with the consequences of child neglect. So well-being, where we get to with well-being is we have these outcomes. Heart disease, we talk about heart disease, type 2 diabetes, chronic obstructive lung disease, lung cancer. These are the typical outcomes that we talk about as being associated with poverty and low socioeconomic status. And we attribute them to smoking, obesity, not taking exercise, poor diet, and so on. It's the easy answer, but it's wrong. Because the problem is individuals' ability to choose a more positive lifestyle is caused by a lack of well-being in those individuals. At the bottom end of the social scale, purpose, meaning, sense of control are significantly lower, and they are more likely to have these adverse outcomes. But it's not just biological outcomes that we're worried about there. Poverty, unemployment, imprisonment, homelessness, drug addiction, and so on are all associated with these behaviours, propensity to violence, etc. And that tracks back to the ability to choose. It tracks back to the fact that early years need to fix it. If you don't fix it, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get health consequences. But what's harder to understand, unless you know the science, is you get these other problems as well. So why does public policy fail to do this? It fails because policy focuses on people's problems, deficiencies. We design services to fix people. We rarely take account of the complex interactions that are behind a lot of these issues, and citizens become passive recipients of services because we do things to them rather than with them. What we have discovered over the past few years, making changes to a number of public services, that what's important is the relationship that you have, that someone who wants to help an individual in difficulty has to be non-judgmental and built on trust and mutual self-esteem. If that happens, the individual realises, this person cares about me, maybe I'm worthwhile, maybe I can take control of my life. And then if he gets the support that he needs, he realigns his life, and what happens is he always comes back to help others once he's achieved that stability in his life. And some examples, the Broadway experiment, for example, in London, looked at 13 rough sleepers who'd been rough sleeping for between 4 and 45 years. Hardcore rough sleepers. They decided that they would have to do things differently. They produced a personalised budget. They put 13 bank accounts together with £3,000 in each of them, and they gave them a mentor who asked them, what matters to you? What do you need? The first person she asked said, well, could I get a new pair of specs? Because I like to read the papers people throw away in the morning, and my specs, I've lost them. Most expensive thing anyone asked for was a guy who said that the only time in his life he'd ever been happy was as a boy when his parents would take him on holiday to a caravan park in Kent. Could they look and see if there was a vacant caravan, and he would go and live in it. A year into the experiment, 11 of these 13 hardcore rough sleepers were in permanent accommodation. A couple of them had undertaken training and were in jobs. And the average spend out of the £3,000 bank accounts was £800. The review of the experiment prompted the economists to say that the most efficient way to spend money on the homeless might just be to give it to them. Yeah, you're right. Beacon and Old Hill Estate in Falmouth was known locally as Beirut. It was a war zone because the main employer, the naval dockyard in Falmouth, had closed down, and between 1996 and 2004 it had just gone crazy, firebombing each other's cars and so on. Two district nurses got together to say enough is enough. They gathered together 4 or 5 local people and said to them, what would make a difference? And they decided that they would set about improving the look of the place. Because So they started mowing people's lawns, cutting down overgrown trees and bushes, painting dilapidated houses, and gradually people learned that they could make a difference. And these are the results that they got: crime down by 50%, unemployment down by 70%, child protection registrations down by 65%. Huge improvements. Citizens' basic income. US and Canada tried it many years ago. It reduced domestic violence, better mental health, hospitalizations in general down significantly. Low birth weight babies reduced because the money that was given to pregnant girls was actually spent on food, not alcohol, as the right-wingers predicted. New Jersey high school graduations went up by 30%, but the whole project was torpedoed because the city of Seattle reported that divorces increased by 50%, and they said, well, that's what happens if you make women financially independent from their husbands, they get divorced. Actually, all the experiments were closed down after that, but when someone went back and looked, there had been no change in the number of divorces in Seattle. This was fake news aimed at getting the project stopped, and we can only surmise who that might have been. The cost of adversity in early life is shown clearly by an experiment in Stoke-on-Trent. What they did was they identified people living really difficult lives, and they calculated that the average cost of each individual to public services was in excess of £100,000 a year. They then implemented this What Matters to You approach and reviewed that a year or so later, and the average cost had fallen to £2,000 a year. Significant reductions in social services costs, local authority costs, health service costs, police criminal justice costs. The only organisation that was spending more money was education, because more of the children were going to school. We need to change the way we think about society and the way in which we work with citizens. And we've been talking about getting to the third curve. Mrs. Thatcher and co introduced new public management, managing public services by setting targets, sanctions, inspections, and so on through performance management systems. That was about keeping power at the centre. And that's still being seen in the health service down in England. Sharing power was something we introduced when we implemented the patient safety programme in the early years collaborative. We asked frontline staff what would make a difference, and they implemented change, and we saw significant improvements. That quality improvement approach is important. What we now need to do is to mobilise social action. Co-production between government and citizens means ceding power to those citizens. Just close by from where I'm standing just now is Adam Smith's house. And Adam Smith, in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, said, how selfish soever a man may be supposed to be, there are some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, even although he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. He was right. We do need to feel as if we are supporting our fellow citizens, not because we make profit out of it, but because it's the right thing to do. I was a medical student in 1971 when the great Jimmy Reid, the leader of the Upper Clyde shipbuilders working, was elected Lord Rector of Glasgow University. His rectorial address was reprinted in full in the New York Times, which described it as the most important piece of public rhetoric since the Gettysburg Address, and that comparison with Abraham Lincoln just didn't do it justice. Basically, what Jimmy talked about was alienation, which he defined as the cry of men who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control, the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision-making, the feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification they have no say in shaping or determining their own destinies. He nailed it. He was a very clever guy, Jimmy Reid, and he describes exactly what goes on in the minds of parents and is transmitted to their children. Joseph Townsend, however, was a doctor. He was also a Church of England cleric, and as a medical graduate of Glasgow University, I like to tell people that Joseph Townsend was a medical graduate of Edinburgh University. What he said was, hunger will tame the fiercest animal. So it will teach decency and civility, obedience and subjection. It is only hunger which can spur and goad the poor on to labour. I would suggest that were Joseph Townsend alive today, he would be working for the Department of Work and Pensions. That's not how we transform society. This guy, the guy on the right in the black garb, is a Catholic priest who 30 years ago was sent to the most violent parish in Los Angeles, where LAPD told him that if he tried to change anything there, he would be dead in half an hour. The Latino gangs would kill him. They broke no interference. 30 years later, he reckons he has probably saved thousands of lives. And he saved thousands of lives by talking to these guys. He would just wander up to them with their guns and their machetes and so on in full display and say, "Hi, how are you?" And ask them what they needed. And basically what they said was, well, if we had jobs to go to, we wouldn't be into drugs and violence. So he got the other guy in the black suit there, a friend of his, to buy a disused bakery, and he started Homeboy Industries. They started baking. He comes to Glasgow regularly, and I take him to schools, and this is what he tells the kids. What we need is a compassion that stands in awe at the burdens the poor have to carry, rather than stands in judgment at how they carry them. This notion of compassion and caring for people in difficulty, not judging them, but caring for them and supporting them, is critical to this. And the final quote that I'll give you comes from this guy, Terry Waite, imprisoned, given what we're seeing in the Middle East just now, imprisoned in Lebanon by extremists for 5 years, told that any day he could be shot and so on. Never saw anyone, completely held incommunicado. And I once had dinner with him and he kept me laughing for 2 hours. He told funny stories about these horrible 5 years. And at the end of it, I said to him, okay, what's the answer to the Middle East? And it was the C word again. At the end of the day, love and compassion will win, is what he said. So where does that leave us? Final slide. If we are going to move society forward, we need to do it through sustainable growth. The world needs sustainability. It needs to be inclusive. We need to include the poor. The poor are much more important than the rich in all of this. And we need to do that by providing good work, inclusive work that allows everyone to participate, through local ownership and ethical investment that allows local communities to thrive. But the critical thing begins at the left end of this slide. A nurturing childhood that produces healthy, educated kids who will be able to contribute to that objective of sustainable economic growth. They will do that by supporting their communities, by being productive in their jobs, and by innovating. What's not to like? Thanks.
Hi everyone, I hope that you found that as engaging and as insightful as I did. We were so pleased when Harry agreed to come and deliver this 2021 Apex lecture, not just because he's so widely known for his persuasive arguments and the depth of his expertise and experience, but also because there's something uniquely compelling in the discourse that at a time when there is so much talk about well-being and opportunities to change the direction of aspects of our society, we should seek to understand before we judge or act. I think we have all heard the inescapable logic today which underpins so much of current justice thinking, from concepts of community justice, early intervention and prevention, and the links between housing, education, economics, justice, mental health and well-being. Do you know justice doesn't live in a bubble on its own? It's an expression of how we choose to manage those whose behaviour causes us concern. And it's high time we moved from the rhetoric to action in doing justice better. The principles we've looked at today and have been opened up to us so brilliantly, really, are embedded in the Apex person-centred approach. But demonstrating value of taking a person-centred approach, taking a well-being approach, has always been difficult. Difficult to display, to demonstrate to commissioners and public alike. Apex Scotland has just been nominated as one of the Robertson Trust's Partners in Change, and together with the excellent Resilience Learning Partnership and assistance from Dundee University and others, we'll be embarking on a 3-year journey exploring how organisations can become fully trauma involved and informed, and what difference approaching those who find themselves in and around the justice system from this perspective can make. Much of what we've heard today resonates with what I genuinely believe is a long overdue groundswell of thinking and willingness to understand the causes of crime and the social and health determinants of it. This is not about excusing crime, it's about moving from a simplistic othering, good citizens versus ne'er-do-wells, towards a grown-up, fairer and essentially compassionate justice system for Scotland, which actually works for everyone. So I really want to thank you, Harry, for such a thoughtful lecture, and I invite those of you who are with us online to ask any questions. Now, this, of course, is the moment when either there's an intensely embarrassing silence followed by an unmanageable torrent of questions, or the system crashes from stress. So I'm going to start the session by picking up on a couple of points which have come across in the talk, and then I can give time for people to respond. So, Harry, you spoke of services and policies failing because they're designed to fix things rather than to deal with people. And I know that's broadly the case, but what do you feel actually needs to change around policy making which might take us closer to that objective?
The critical thing is to ask people what the problem is. We, from our position and professions and so on, make a judgment about individuals and their lives. We don't know what's been going on in their lives. And time again, I have encountered individuals who have got into trouble, who behave badly, who have all sorts of difficult aspects to their life. And when you actually sit down and get to know them, you find they have had appalling influences in early life, particularly. And it's a sense of hopelessness that builds in them, learned helplessness. They're told as children that they're stupid, their parents have violence and the kid gets the blame for the violence, then the kid gets the blame if there's any trouble at school, and the kid grows up believing that he is worthless. And you can turn that around. You can actually lock them away, or you can say to them, what do you need to live a better life? And surely that second approach is the more humane way of doing it, but also it's the best way for society, turn people away from damaging society into productive members of society. And we've really got to get to grips with that. Problem is that too often people come along and say, I know what the solution is here and I'm going to apply that solution. Frontline staff working with individuals living difficult lives, asking them what to do, can transform those lives if we give them the freedom and permission to do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot of questions around how we take this forward when the government seems fairly fixed in its views of justice.
Yeah.
And also I'd like to just add to that, in terms of a more compassionate justice system, I wonder if you could reflect on the First Minister's announcement in the programme for government today that Scottish Government will spend £500 million on upgrading the Scottish prison estate. I wonder if you'd reflect on the role of prisons specifically in terms of a compassionate justice system.
Okay. Politicians and civil servants work by creating policy, and they want to do a thing. A policy means we will do X or Y or Z. The origins of just about all the problems that we're dealing with are complex, and you don't change a complex system by doing a thing to it. There's lots and lots of things you have to do. And this is what we discovered with our patient safety programme and our early years programme. Frontline staff would come up with suggestions for things they could do. They would test them. You would see what worked. And then when you spread the learning about that and everyone started to do the things that worked, you got the whole complex system changing direction. And you know, there is a view, you know, the media and so on, politicians don't want to be seen as being soft on crime. We should be very hard on the causes of crime, and that's neglect and lack of support for families who are struggling. That's the cause of it, and we need to be very focused on that, and we need to adopt an improvement approach to that because it's a complex issue. As far as spending 500 million on I hadn't heard that. Was that about improving the structure, the physical aspects of prisons and so on?
The question suggests it's on the prison estate.
The prison estate. Well, it would be a lot better to spend a lot of money on supporting prisoners to learn to feel positive about their futures, to learn to take control. And we know how to do this because I've encountered lots of people who've been in prison, who've had that experience and have gone on to live very productive lives. Spend money on... I once said to a minister who asked me if we invested in families, would it make an improvement? And I said to him, yeah, but it might take a while, but then you will have closed prisons. And to do this particular politician justice, the reply was, that's exactly the right thing to do. Invest in families and you will not need so many prisons.
I think I'm on record as saying many, many times that a justice system's key responsibility is to stop people going into prison.
Yes, exactly.
There's a question here about, do you have any insights regarding gender differences in public health outcomes? The graph on failing life expectancy against the national average maps precisely on the period of industrial decline and falling male employment. And the question basically talks about female participation in the workforce increasing steadily over the last 50 years. What's happened to outcomes for women?
Yeah, I mean, there are gaps in life expectancy for women as well as men. Most of the studies that have been done on things like stress responses and so on have been done on men. Men tend to have more vigorous stress responses in a number of areas than women. Men are the hunter, in evolutionary terms, men are the hunter-gatherers that had to go out there and run after animals and all that kind of thing. So that's what has been developed. But there are still significant issues that will affect, women as well as men. And women offend and go to prison and so on, and the same sort of processes, the same kind of support is necessary for them, because when you look at the history, they will have experienced the same kind of adversity in early life. Adverse childhood experiences study applied to women as well as to girls as well as boys.
Yeah, thanks. There's a number of questions which are talking about how do we realise that staff displaying, how do we get managers to recognise that staff displaying compassion are doing so, doing the right thing, rather than obsession with targets.
Part of that comes from a kind of top-down thing, the targets and indicators culture that says you will do X, Y, and Z. Managers want to tick those boxes, and if those boxes don't include compassionate care, then you've got a problem. How do you measure compassionate care? Well, ask the people who've been through the system. Ask the people who have experienced compassionate care. I remember when we were doing our patient safety program, one of the things that one group of nurses came out with was the fact that every day a consultant comes in and writes down his orders for the patient, and the nurses will write down their orders for the patient. No one asks the patient what they would like to happen each day. And I've got a picture, a slide, of a woman sitting in an intensive care bed with being ventilated, and she's cuddling a large Labrador dog, because her order for the day was, I'd love to see my dog. And they said, why not? It's that kind of thing. You go, you ask what matters to you, and you allow people to achieve what matters to them, and they feel much better about themselves and about the environment they're in. I must say, in my day, the matron of the Royal Infirmary would have gone ballistic if we'd allowed a dog into the intensive care unit, but that's, times change.
Yeah. No, for sure. We've just got time for one more quick question, and I think it's a nice one to finish up with, really. If you could introduce one thing immediately to improve compassion, what would it be, other than the obvious of shutting down the Daily Mail?
Yeah, well, I'd be up for that. So this idea, for some people are bad because they make bad decisions and there is an evil streak in them. Actually, the one thing I would introduce was a clear understanding that many people, and I'm not denying that there are some people who do have an evil streak in them for one reason or another, and quite often it's all about, it's rich people pursuing even more money than they have, but the average individual who struggles in his life and goes off the rails has to be helped back into a compassionate life by showing them compassion. And punishing them for going off the rails is not showing them compassion. It's, okay, we may need to, I've visited prisons and I've spent time in looking at young people in Parliament and so on, and talking to them about their future, and the reply you would get would be, you're due out in a couple of weeks, what are you going to do? I'll never get a job because I've got a criminal record. So what are you going to do? I'll probably just drink and watch telly. And what they don't factor into the equation is the fact that the girlfriend will have a baby, and the baby will be born into a chaotic household, and that baby will grow up with difficulty. It's breaking that chain of feeling hopeless that is the key to a better future.
that's a great place to end on, I think. I'm afraid we've got no more time, but I'd just like to thank everyone for their interest, as shown by the level of attendance and the great questions. For those who want to re-listen, or who have colleagues who have been unable to attend the lecture, it will, as always, be recorded and will be held on the Apex Scotland website at www.apexscotland.org.uk. As always, special thanks tonight go to Blue Lizard and Live Systems, who have made all the tech stuff run really, really well. Thank you so much for that. To the staff of the Radisson Hotel who've been looking after us, and as always, a really special mention to Lynn Hannah for organising and managing the event in her usual exemplary manner. Thanks finally once again to Harry Burns for, I think, what has been an outstanding lecture, a really challenging lecture, and one which I think takes us forward in our thinking and our desire for a new and more enlightened justice system. You who have supported this, I give you thanks for that, and I just hope that you will take the messages that we've heard tonight forward into the work that you do. And hopefully we'll see you next year in person. So see you there. Good night.